historians, and welcome to the next lesson in our Nazi Germany topic. This one is looking at the Jewish people within Nazi Germany and the treatment of them as part of the treatment of the national minorities and other groups within Germany. For this lesson, what you want to be able to do is to describe the ways that the Nazis were persecuting the Jews and to be able to explain why the persecution of the Jewish people was useful to the Nazi Party moving forward. So wherever you're taking your notes for this one, put the heading and move on with the lesson. So just in terms of a quick overview, persecution of Jewish people is referred to as anti-Semitism. All across Europe for hundreds of years, Jewish people have found themselves persecuted for being different, for being what we'd sometimes refer to as a nomad group, which means that they move around and settle in areas where they're maybe not originally from, and basically this had resulted in a lot of hatred from a lot of different countries and a lot of different people over the years. The whole point of anti-Semitic propaganda in Germany, which is something that we looked at last week, was basically to make the Germans hate and fear the Jews and use them as a scapegoat to blame most of Germany's problems on. So throughout the 1930s, the Nazis started to persecute the Jews in Germany and increased this to the point that by the 1940s, which is after our topic obviously ends, the Nazi final solution to the Jewish problem was starting to take place. And this is obviously what we refer to as the Holocaust. It resulted in the mass murder of 6 million Jewish people. It is really important to keep in mind that when we are thinking about the Jewish people, our topic ends in 1939. So we are looking at the process of persecution of the Jews up to 1939, but the Holocaust and the events of the final solution, which include things like Jewish people being made to wear the Star of David on their clothing, did not happen until the 1940s in Germany. So it's not part of the topic and it isn't something that you should use in any of your answers. That happened after the topic's end date, which means that you cannot use that as an argument. So according to the Nazis, what was a Jew? The Nazis basically used propaganda, amongst other things, to define exactly what a Jewish person was. It wasn't just a matter of your faith and your belief system any longer, like it is in most countries where it's a person who believes a particular religion. In Nazi Germany, Jews were defined by their race, their blood, or who their parents and grandparents were. The Nazi scientists produced reports of experiments they had conducted to prove Aryan superiority over these unmentionable people, and they used these so-called experiments to define who these people were. So things like, for example, looking at the sort of shape of your face and your nose, and sort of how far apart your nostrils and stuff were, or the width of your nose, defined if you were Jewish or Aryan. The colour of your eyes, there was a chart that said which ones were acceptable and which ones were not, and if you matched with an unacceptable one, then you were a Jew. So if a person had at least 3 Jewish grandparents, then they were of the Jewish race. If a person had 2 Jewish grandparents, then they were a half Jew. If they had 1 Jewish grandparent, then they were a quarter Jew. Now, at this point in time, quarter Jews were hardly affected by the Nazi persecution, but pure and half Jews really did suffer the full force of this. And charts like these that helps you work out who was a Jew actually told you who you could be kind of friends with and who you were meant to be against. And this is based on a so-called genetic research, which is proving again that the Aryan people are superior. So why were they persecuted? Now, at the time of the Nazi takeover in 1933, when Hitler becomes Chancellor, Jews made up less than 1% of the German population. However, despite this, Hitler built on old feelings of anti-Semitism that were quite common in Europe against the Jewish people to create a scapegoat or someone to blame for all of the problems. Now, unlike the Weimar Republic, he's not going to take responsibility for any of the problems that are happening in Germany that his government could be blamed for, and instead what he does is he says no, it is the communists to blame for some things and it is the Jews that are to blame for other things. And he uses that continual mantra as part of propaganda to encourage people to turn against them and to blame them for the things that are going on in Germany. It's important to remember that it was also not only Jewish people that the Nazis persecuted, they also took it out against the communists, they were against the gypsies, any sort of homosexual people whatsoever, anyone who was mentally or physically handicapped or disabled, anyone who was mentally ill, and other people as well, which is what we're going to look at in the next lesson. But it's worthwhile keeping in mind that it was any group that the Nazis saw as being un-Aryan or undesirable or had qualities that were undesirable. The Jewish people in particular were just the easiest to scapegoat and blame for so much because this anti-Semitism had already existed. What did Hitler have to say about the Jews? Lucy Davidovich in 1977 said, "The Jews inhabited Hitler's mind. He believed that they were the source of all evil, misfortune and tragedy. They were devils whom he had been given a divine mission to destroy." Basically, he said that Jews were responsible for everything wrong with Germany. In Mein Kampf, he blames them for losing World War I. According to the Nazis, Jews were responsible for Germany's economic crises and plotting with the communists to take over first Germany and then the world. And according to Hitler, Jews were polluting the Aryan master race. So all of these things were what he said about the Jews, and that's the reason why they had to be gotten rid of. When we refer to the master race, this is what we're talking about. Pure Germans belonged to a North European master race, according to Hitler. He called them the true Aryans, and ideally they would have blue eyes and blonde hair, they would be tall and they'd be fit. They didn't have to fit into this category to be considered Aryan, but true Aryans did. They were the perfect examples. Hitler claimed that Jewish people were polluting this master race and weakening it, and it was their duty, basically ordained by God, to get rid of the Jews and stop them from polluting this master race that Hitler was told by God to develop and take forward. Quick query for you in general then, think about what is happening in these pictures to Hitler across time. So you've got picture number 1 here, picture number 2 and picture number 3. And if you think about what you can actually see, his dark hair and his dark eyes are really obvious in this early picture just as he becomes Chancellor. But as time goes on and more propaganda is being focused on this idea of the master race and against the Jewish people, you can see that his appearance is starting to lighten. His hair doesn't go exactly blonde, but it definitely lightens, and his eyes do become bluer and lighter as time goes on to make him actually more suitable for this Aryan master race title. So why did Hitler hate the Jews? He argued that anti-Semitism was a self-fulfilling prophecy. Jews were historically blamed for killing Christ, so they were A, politically denied basic rights in many Christian countries, and B, economically excluded from certain professions. As a result, they either A, became poor and so attracted to communism, which frightened the wealthy people, or B, became very rich by setting themselves up as moneylenders, which was a profession that Christians were not allowed to do according to the Bible, so they were hated by the poor. And according to Hitler, this was one of the reasons why people hated the Jews, and he built up on this. So immediately after the elections to the Reichstag, on the 5th of March 1933, persecution of Jewish people began. Jewish people were attacked, some were killed, Jewish businesses were harassed, and some were even destroyed. However, even before this, Hitler and the Nazis were talking openly about anti-Jewish ideas. Hitler had read about how coloured or African American people, black people, had been denied civil rights in parts of South America, and at first Hitler wanted to make life so unpleasant for Jews in Germany that they would choose to leave, and that was kind of his idea of doing that to begin with. It's worthwhile taking a note from this slide. So we're just going to say, after the elections to the Reichstag on the 5th of March 1933, persecution of Jews began. Jews were attacked, some were killed, and Jewish businesses were harassed and some were even destroyed. At first, Hitler wanted to make life so unpleasant for Jews in Germany that they would choose to leave Germany. So quick note from the slide before we move on. So the Nazis began to openly persecute the Jews on the 1st of April 1933, when a one-day boycott of Jewish-owned shops took place. Members of the SA, remember Hitler's private army at the time, stood outside the Jewish shops to make sure that the boycott was successful, and you can see them doing that in this picture here. By 1934, all Jewish shops were marked with a yellow Star of David or the word Juden written in the windows. Again, it's worthwhile noting that this is not something the Jewish people had to wear. That happens later in the 1940s after our topic. What happens then next is that Jewish people were excluded from many professions. Civil servants and teachers were fired, and they were not allowed to edit newspapers or to study law from that point onwards. So we're going to just take a quick note from this slide as well. So the Nazis began to openly persecute the Jews on the 1st of April 1933, when a one-day boycott of Jewish-owned shops took place. By 1934, all Jewish shops were marked with a yellow Star of David or had the word Juden written in the window, and Jews were excluded from many professions. After 1933, the persecution of Jews happened in 3 waves, and each wave discrimination against them became worse and worse. So again, quick note for this one. And obviously, if you were highlighting this, it would be much neater than what I'm doing here. So it happened in 3 waves, and after each wave, things became worse and worse for Jewish people. The first wave starts in April 1933, and we've got the boycott of Jewish shops and goods. They wouldn't buy from Jewish people, and we've got the very first anti-Semitic or anti-Jew laws being written by the Nazis, which we'll come back to. The second wave starts in 1935. Violence against the Jews starts more often in the streets, and the Nuremberg Laws, which removed citizenship from Jews and banned them from a lot of public things, then took place. And then we've got the third and final wave, which happens in 1938 onwards, where we've got more violence against the Jews, which ended in Kristallnacht, which we'll talk about. After the Nuremberg Laws in 1935, Jews were no longer classed as citizens, and thousands of them were sent to the ghettos and the concentration camps from 1938 onwards. So you might want to take a minute to pause this slide at each of the different waves, because they do overlap, and just make sure you have these things written down before you move on. So anti-Jewish policy wave 1, then, just in a wee bit in more detail. So a wave of new laws were introduced. On buses and trains and park benches, Jews had to sit on specifically marked seats. They weren't allowed to just sit anywhere. Non-Jewish children at schools were taught to hate and persecute Jewish people in general in the streets, and were praised for doing it. Say, for example, if they threw a rock at a Jewish person, that was praised. Teachers would humiliate Jews in schools, so Jewish school children would be humiliated by their teachers. When Jewish people were bullied by other school children, nothing was actually done about it. It was encouraged, in fact. This caused quite a lot of Jewish children to stop attending schools because they were being bullied, and that was not just by the kids but by teachers as well. And the Nazis launched propaganda that then said the Jewish children were lazy and couldn't be educated and couldn't be bothered with their education, which made people quite angry at that point in time. We can see some propaganda here, which we have looked at briefly in the propaganda lesson. This poster from the propaganda film The Eternal Jew, which starts showing in Germany on the 28th of November 1940. Again, stereotypical Jewish bad guy in this film. You've got posters like this which show that these Jewish people are both capitalists by taking the money from the German people and also are somehow both communists, and those two things are not the same, and it is not actually possible to be both of those things at the same time. They're completely polar opposite ideologies to be both these things at the same time. And we also have this, for example, shows a Jewish spider who is taking victims from nice, decent sort of German people and obviously treating them like victims. Think about how these images actually show what the Nazis wanted Jewish people to be seen like after this first wave becomes, you know, part of Jewish propaganda, Nazi propaganda against them. What is it that they're trying to display? So in school books, newspapers, films, the Nazi messages and images of Jewish people reinforced the idea that they were a threat to German society. So basically everywhere that you looked, there was this repeated propaganda message that told you Jewish people are a threat. They're polluting the bloodline, they are a threat to people, they're a threat to German society, they're a threat to German way of life. Every children's storybook that was published at this point in time had an anti-Semitic message in them. Jewish people's books were burned, especially as part of these book burnings, and they would write books where, you know, the hero of a nice German Aryan child would always win against these evil Jewish people. Things like this. This cartoon is from a German school book in the interwar period. If you think about the message that this is actually trying to give the German school children, here we've got a Jewish person who obviously has this Jewish child. The Jewish child has lured one of his classmates or someone from school, nice Aryan girl, to an older Jewish person. They are stereotypically dressed, and he's offering her jewellery or some other sort of thing to get her to come with him, with this idea that he's going to take her away, and obviously he's going to then pollute the German bloodline, purposely using her. So that sort of message coming across is obviously very negative towards Jewish people, and does kind of scaremonger a bit, and that's the whole point of the propaganda behind it. Okay, so wave 2 and 3 resulted from something referred to as the Nuremberg Laws. So these were passed in 1935. Hitler basically wanted to make life so unpleasant, like we've already said, for Jewish people, that they would emigrate and go. Elsewhere, Jewish immigration did increase. You had to pay a fine to be allowed to leave the country, which meant not everybody could. And approximately 300,000 of the 500,000 in Germany actually left between 1933 and 1941 before emigration was forcibly halted. For those Jewish people that could not afford to escape from Germany, life got increasingly more difficult. Many shops would not sell food to them, and a lot of chemists refused to sell to them too, which made medicines really difficult to get hold of. The rule that Jews could no longer be citizens of Germany was passed in the Nuremberg Laws, which meant they did not have the protection of the law because they were no longer German citizens, and they had no official papers or passports, which meant that they couldn't leave the country even if they wanted to. They were no longer citizens, they no longer had any sort of civil rights within Germany at this point in time. So, we're going to look at these laws in a little bit more detail. If you put the subtitle Persecution by Law, it says on your desks, but obviously in the team, there are some law cards which were passed in Nazi Germany. What you're going to do, if you are in school, you're going to do this as a pair with the person in front of you, or you're going to do it by yourself if you're obviously not in school or you'd prefer that. You're going to look at the laws and put them into chronological order from the earliest to the latest. And all I want you to do is make a timeline with the date of the law and then just a brief one sentence comment of what the law actually was. And I want you to think about what is happening over the years in these particular laws. What we're now going to do is we're going to categorise these cards into 3 different groups. So we're going to put laws that are social, so things against the living and working conditions. We're going to put political, so things about voting and citizenship. And we're going to put economic, which is going to be money and jobs. So you may want to organise the cards into these 3 groups. If you're doing it at home, you may want to colour code it, or you're welcome to write it if you really want under these 3 different headings and organise them into these different categories. For the third task, you're now going to take the laws and put them in order of your opinion, the least to the most horrible and severe. So which law do you think is the least severe law, the one that you could probably live with happening, and which one is the one that you think is the most severe law? Obviously, when you're in school, we'll have a chat about this, and you can then decide underneath where you've done this or in your jotter, the thing you're going to write down is which one you've picked and why you've picked it. Just as another example, this is a report from 1943 talking about the Nuremberg laws, and it's from a Jewish woman, and she refers to this fact that they had a budgie, a pet. So she says, "We had a budgie. We heard of the regulation that Jews were not allowed to keep pets. My husband couldn't bear to be parted from the bird. Perhaps someone announced him, for one day my husband got a summons to go to the Gestapo. After many weeks of anxious waiting, I received a card from the police telling me to collect my husband's urn on payment of a fee of 3 Reichsmark." So basically, because he had this budgie, he had been summoned to the Gestapo and as a result had been killed and cremated because he'd broken this law. This is happening in 1943, obviously after our topic ends, so it is likely that he possibly did end up in a concentration camp. So despite even the fact that during waves kind of 2 and into 3 we have the Nuremberg laws, which made life very difficult for Jewish people living in Germany, we actually see this intensify in 1938. So in 1938, this violence against the Jewish people suddenly became much more intense and it spread nationwide. This all happens after the Nazi government started to spread a rumour that a young Jewish man had horribly murdered a German politician in Paris. This then leads to, on the night of the 10th of November 1938, 7,500 Jewish shops having their windows smashed, 900 synagogues being burnt down, and 91 Jewish people being killed, and 20,000 Jewish people being rounded up and sent to the ghettos. This was referred to as the Night of Broken Glass, aka Kristallnacht, and it was the start of more and more violence towards the Jewish people, definitely the point where they start being rounded up and put into the ghettos more likely, and definitely the beginning of the final solution. This has a video clip which you'll be able to see in the playlist, which you can go and have a look at for the Kristallnacht. It gives you a little bit more detail and you can kind of see the things going on there, so I would really strongly suggest that people watch it. Basically then, to add insult to injury, despite the huge amount of damage that was done to Jewish property, the Jewish community was ordered to pay 1 billion marks for the damage and the cleanup afterwards, which we're just going to put as another note there. So they were ordered to pay for the damage that was done to their businesses by the German government. Ultimately, why did it happen? The Nazis claimed that the attacks were just the natural reaction of the German people after a Jewish person had killed this politician in Paris. American eyewitnesses actually wrote that the next morning, when German people came out of their homes, they were actually very confused at the level of destruction, and later official orders were actually found that said it was the Nazi party themselves that had actually started this off and had encouraged it, and it was the Hitler Youth, amongst others, that were actually responsible. So, thinking about kind of goings on at this point in time, imagine if you're a loyal German, you're listening to the radio the morning after Kristallnacht, and Goebbels has informed you of the reason why this event needed to happen. You also hear that 1 billion Reichmarks worth of damage has been caused and that the mess needs to be cleaned up by the undesirable people. So these pictures below give you letters of people that you would actually want to clear up the mess. So you're going to choose which ones you think would be responsible for it. So take a second to kind of think about what you can see. So sources A, sources B, C, D, E and F. Which people are likely to be the ones you want to clear it up? Hopefully what you've said is A and D. That's the kind of the ones that we look at for the undesirables. Those are the ones that we would expect to be seeing these stereotypical Jewish people cleaning it up. So you turn off your radio and you go outside and you notice this family in the street looking like they're going to offer to help to clean up. What advice might you give them? So you might say something like, oh no, don't worry, the undesirables are going to clean up this mess, this is not for you to do. You might say, what a mess this is. You might say to them, you better get out of here, there's going to be undesirables coming to clean up this mess. Their response to you is going to be, we've been ordered to clear up this mess because we are Jewish. Now, why might you be confused about this, seeing those stereotypical images versus this family being the ones who are actively being told to do it, this Jewish family? Think about what might be confusing if you were living in Germany at the time of this event. So we've got the stereotypes, and we've got this idea of the German family, the nice propaganda pieces that we know about what a perfect Aryan German family should look like. Do this family fit into these stereotypes, or do they more likely fit into the other propaganda pieces? So it is quite confusing. Now, a key kind of point is that accepting an event is not necessarily the same with agreeing with it. And quite often what we find when we talk about the Holocaust and the surrounding events is that people really think, well, why did the German people go along with it? For most ordinary Germans, they were not strongly anti-Semitic. Some were, but not on the scale that these events would suggest. They did not take much part in the oppression, though they didn't actually do much to prevent it or protest against it, except where there was violence. Even then, they didn't really dare to do much because they were afraid of what might happen to them, and in the end it was easier to accept it, even if they didn't agree. This links back to this idea of what we talked about last week as well, about why opposition was not successful in certain respects, because it was just easier to go along with it rather than stand up. And that is a very difficult thing to kind of keep in mind, that not all the German people actually agreed with this, even if they did go along with it. Okay, so on the side there's a comparison question about the events of Kristallnacht for you to do, and you can come back to it if you want to pause the video and do that as practice. Then we can see persecution moving into genocide. So the events of Kristallnacht were the most organised attempt so far to persecute the Jews in Nazi Germany, but it was about to get very much worse. By 1939, the desire of the Nazis to wipe out the Jews was very clear, and during World War II, where our topic ends, the Nazis developed the technology to murder millions of them, which is the beginning of the final solution. Jewish people were moved and resettled in ghettos, and after that they were sent to concentration and extermination camps. So ultimately what had started off as persecution later on evolved into a policy of just general genocide. The suffering of the Jewish people and the other groups in Germany, remember, because it wasn't just Jewish people, even though that's what we've been focused on in this lesson, did not end until the Allied armies arrived and defeated the Nazis in 1945. So, your assignment task for this lesson, you're going to watch a clip, which I will put the link to in the team, and you're going to answer the questions which you can see here in the team and upload your answers on the team quiz. You might want to make a note of the questions and use this to answer them as you go. Finally, we've got an explain question for you to do as well as practice. So explain how Jewish people were persecuted between 1933 and 1939. So use the information that you've taken from this lesson to answer this explain question. You do not need to upload it, but I would really strongly suggest that you do it in your jotter, and you feel free to show it to your teacher when you are in school.